wait for it to come. I'll give it a few seconds because on one of them it's missed my audio off at the beginning.
Oh,
I think I spoke too early.
it looks like we're recording now, so.
I don't see it on my side.
Yeah, I saw it.
Yeah, I've got all the transcription coming through at the minute.
All right, perfect.
Yeah,
So,
until they make that a premium feature.
exactly.
There was quite a lot of interesting feedback about that.
Yeah, I've seen some weird and wonderful stuff come through that transcription. Let me tell you. Okay, everybody ready?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hello and welcome back to another All Things M365 Compliance. I'm Ryan Murphy, and obviously I'm joined today again by Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, thank you very much, Ryan. Yeah, so I'm Nikki Chappell, Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway and MVP. And today I'd like to introduce you to Simon Hudson, who has joined us as a guest. Over to you, Simon, to introduce yourself.
Well, I guess I ought to introduce myself. So, so some of you will know me from the Microsoft community. I am very proud to have been made an MVP this year, about the same time as you did, Nikki. So that was rather nice for us both. But I've been knocking around the UK community and to some extent the international Microsoft community for 10 or 12 years, I suppose. I have a relatively complex background, and we've only got half an hour, so I won't go into the detail. But I am a three-time entrepreneur. So I originally was the founder of Cloud2, which some of you know if you remember back to the early days of SharePoint and SharePoint out of the box. Because we did the first out-of-the-box SharePoint intranet solution in the world, as far as we could tell. I founded a small medtech company, Kanata, that does a whole bunch of stuff around enabling clinicians to talk to each other about real clinical cases. And I think that's what we're going to talk about a fair bit today, because I continue in my role as Senior Information Risk Officer on that. So I carry the can on a lot of stuff to do with governance, risk and compliance in that business. And I have a small, inevitably, a small Microsoft consulting business that backs up my MVP activity. But originally I'm a physicist. And I spent 15 years in the medical device industry. So those two things combined to give me a very interesting background.
Okay, that's really useful. I didn't realise that you were a physicist by trade.
I'm giving a lecture on that next week at one of the universities I help.
Exciting and interesting.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we're really interested today is about your role as being responsible for data within the medical company that you've got in Kanata, because obviously medical data is highly sensitive data. It's no longer, it's not just names and addresses. You have to put that extra layer of kind of governance and security controls on it. So we'd really like to understand a little bit is how did you use kind of the Microsoft functionality? How has that helped improve your kind of governance, risk and compliance posture?
Well, I guess we should go back even before we bring the Microsoft pieces, the tools into play, and actually understand a bit about, what the risks and requirements, obligations are when you're dealing with highly sensitive personal data, which in my case is clinical data, but it can apply to all sorts of other things as well. We're not the only type of organisation exposed to these governance, risk, compliance requirements. So our clients, GPs and specialists on the platform, are directly looking at patients, talking to patients, making diagnoses, and then trying to decide what they're going to do to treat that patient. And it really doesn't matter, how sensitive or otherwise that clinical condition that's being treated might appear to be. It's all at risk clinical data with some very personal information, starting at their name and date of birth, so proper identifiers, going all the way through to the kind of things that are actually wrong with them that they may not even want their family to know about. So very important, very sensitive data. It has the highest rating of data sensitivity within the legislation and within the NHS governance strictures. So third-party companies like us are obligated to demonstrate that we not only have all of our security pieces in place, because that's what protects people from getting into our data, but that our internal processes make sure that we treat that data in the right way. And I guess I even need to be careful with the word data, because I don't think about it as data. Data always feels to me like numbers and tables. This is information about real people. So we've got a whole bunch of fiery hoops as an organisation we have to jump through. We have to effectively come up with some NHS imposed certification. There's a thing called the Digital Security and Protection Toolkit that I've been filling out for the companies I run for probably 8 years, 9 years, something like that. So we've got quite good at completing that. But we were one of the first organisations in the UK to go through that DSPT process. I guess on top of that is layered now cybersecurity, which is security, not security and governance, etc. But it's appropriately aligned. And then there's a bunch of other things, DTAC, and this kind of goes on of the number of externally imposed compliance obligations that we have. And as a director of the company, with Kanata, if we screw up, I'm directly accountable for that. So I can be the one that goes to jail if we get it wrong. So it's kind of personally important to me that we ensure that our GRC posture is correct, that we've done the right things, regardless of what the compliance regulations say, that we're doing the right things internally. So we've got processes that are managing all of that, and that we push those responsibilities down to the other people we deal with. So actually, going off on a tangent, the biggest risk point that we have in the business is actually what our clients do. We have had, not recently, thankfully, but we've had many incidents where our clients have sent us their patients' data in the clear oftentimes. So we've got a moral duty to make sure that we're actually pushing the things that we've become really good at around GRC back down to our NHS clients who maybe aren't as good at this stuff as we are. So that's interesting, and certainly something that has kept me awake at night. And we certainly have had occasions when we've had to run around, like with our heads on fire because a client has done something highly inappropriate that we have to then put to bed, maybe advise the ICO, because we have an obligation to do reporting, even if it wasn't us that screwed up, and make sure that we educate them appropriately. So look, that's the context in which we operate. I think it's very interesting. These days, I have some staff who I've managed to delegate the general day-to-day data protection officer type of stuff to. But when it comes to that strategic stuff, the board representation of governance, risk, and compliance, that sits with me. I'll let you get a word in now.
No, I think that's really interesting to kind of put it into context, because obviously people listening to this podcast will come from all sorts of different types of industries, some of them that are not as highly regulated as your organisation. But I think it's really important, no matter what type of data or information. I think you're right, it's information. It's what can be done if we if the wrong people have access to that data. We've all got a duty, no matter where we are and what position we are in the organisation, to look after data and to ensure that that information is protected appropriately. And I think for the leaders of the organisation, it's really important to set that expectation and make sure everybody in that organisation is fully aware of what rules, what you can and can't do.
Absolutely. Yeah, it stretches all the way across the organisation, and you make the point, and I'm fully on board with that. Every organisation, don't care if they're a mom and pop business, they're running out of a garage, or they're a multinational, every organisation has got GRC obligations. They may not be quite as extreme as a medical company or a financial company, but everyone has. And so the principles apply across the board. How difficult it is to achieve that varies according to the company, but everyone has it.
That's interesting.
So continuing the theme, with those obligations, then you move on to the question of how. How do you actually implement all of this stuff? So really from the early days, because initially we talked a lot about governance, the risk and compliance piece is relatively recent bolt onto that, partly driven by the fact that Microsoft uses that terminology. I think it's still right, but most of what we were obligated to do was think about information governance. And so right from again, 8-9 years ago, we used SharePoint to build a information governance portal. A site, but it's a portal within the businesses, and that's where we managed things like risk registers and asset registers and tracked training records, because all the staff have to be compliant. So we put all of them through basic governance training, and these days it's GRC training. We manage all that, so we have a portal to manage that. So that's the point at which the sort of the externally imposed requirements sort of touched the technology for the first time as we built a tool. And because I'm kind of a SharePoint guy, I built it in SharePoint. Other technologies may apply, but I'm struggling to think of a better one. And then, of course, Microsoft comes along, first of all, and interestingly, with their secure score. They took this sort of metric-based approach to looking at organizational security. And as I said before, that for me is really interesting because security has to go hand in hand with the GRC stuff. You can have fantastic GRC processes, and if your security sucks, you're still going to be non-compliant and put the business at risk. So they came along with this nice, relatively objective measure of secure score. And I spent some time over the years looking at that with my various businesses, gradually trying to make sure that we were at a level on that which I considered to be acceptable. We have to talk about what that actually means in a few minutes, I think. But reaching a point that that I, as an at-risk person, i.e., I'm the accountable person that goes to jail if I get it wrong, I need to be happy that myself and my other board directors are comfortable with our security profile, so that we have minimised that risk to the business. And so that idea of having a objective metric, secure score, was really good. And I guess early this year, I decided that we needed to actually have a bit of a program within Canata just to raise that because it wasn't as good as I would have liked. And we went through a very easy, actually, in the end of things, a relatively easy process of basically increasing our score from the high 40% on the secure score as it was then. And I think when I spoke to my team, because we raised this basically at every Monday morning meeting, I think we were hit at 84 or 87%. So we were pretty happy with that. We actually may have rolled a couple of things back because they were getting in the way of doing some of our operational activities. So we could be higher, but we then have to start making some judgment calls about, are we more secure, but we degrade our service or whatever. So there's some interesting management decisions to be made. But in parallel, Microsoft, of course, with the frankly quite impressive work they've done to try and introduce governance risk compliance in their platform, they introduced the Purview compliance scores. And I looked at that, and you and I have spoken about this in the past, Nikki. If you're just running Microsoft 365, you're going to have an acceptable, low but acceptable score. You're again going to be automatically in the 40-ish%, just because 365 takes on a lot of the burden of doing governance risk compliance for you. But, and this is where it became really interesting, I thought, great, we'll do what we did with Secure Score. We'll throw a few weeks of man effort at it and get it from 40-something to 80-something, and the job's a kipper. Right, well, that's where things get interesting, because I said Microsoft have done a pretty good job. They've really gone into a fair bit of detail with Purview, and where in Secure Score, there's a few handfuls of different things you have to do. When you look at Purview, there are thousands of items on the list. Mm-hmm. So what for me in the business with Secure Score was, look, here's a task list. Steve, go away and work through that list, and when we've done most of them, our score will be great. And I looked at that same list, and it's like it was thousands of items for compliance, and I couldn't give that to my operations director. And instead of saying this is a task, we took a very strong view that doing GRC and elevating our secure score, our Purview score, is actually a program of work. So we now have a weekly, it's not long, but a weekly compliance meeting. And we look at what else we can look at this week on that list of 2,000 items, and we'll action it and see if we can get it ticked off by this time next week, because there's so much of it. And we think that process is almost certainly an indefinitely long activity. We're always going to be working on things to improve our score. I think we're up into the low 70s now. So, you hit the low-hanging fruit first. But that compliance score has gone up quite nicely, but I'd like it to be higher. It's going to take, months and months and months to get there. So that's been a very interesting exercise. But then I go back to, so you do feel free to interrupt me, because I will just keep talking until the podcast runs out. But I then go back to what I said earlier, is that I built a portal originally for some other things, like doing risk loss and issue asset loss and staff training. And I look at Purview and impressed I am by it. A lot of that stuff isn't there. So it helps you track a bunch of useful metrics. It does lots of great stuff around what Microsoft 365 can do for you. So, you can do some great stuff around, managing access to content and putting sort of leases on it so that stuff expires in the appropriate time, all that kind of stuff, and tagging and all that cool and useful things. That's my doorbell going, if you can hear it. Probably an Amazon delivery, of course. But it doesn't do the other things which are really important in the business. And so, Nikki and I, you and I talked about it in the lead up to the session we did at Collab Days last month. We think that underlying all of this GRC activity are actually three main sort of pillars that you've got to address in the business. And the technology piece that Purview is perhaps the third, not the first or the second of those. And the first two are really around having your people and your processes sorted out. And so there's these three pillars that you've got to have to do great GRC in the company to let the directors sleep at night. So that's about making sure it comes down to make sure you've got a leadership driven strategy, because there are going to be decisions that are going to have to be made. Just as I told you with that security thing, we actually rolled a couple of the security improvements back because it got in the way of operational efficiency, which would actually ultimately had a detrimental effect on clients. There are going to be strategic decisions you have to make around the GRC posture, and that's the leadership activity. Then you've got to make sure that you, having taken that strategy, roll it out to the organisation in an appropriate way, and that often means getting people on board with it, buying them into the importance of GRC. Lots of people, including senior managers, will never have really thought about it in the way that we're talking about it today. So we need to get them on board, make sure that they understand that GRC is everybody's obligation and duty in the business. It's not something you can pass over the wall, like we kind of probably unwise to do with security, where we pass that over the wall into the IT department and goes, you guys go and make things secure, just make sure the staff don't break it. With GRC, we've actually really got to embed that in everyone's ways of working and in their psyche. So there's a much bigger, more important, I would argue, task around GRC.
I was just going to say, I think for that is really important, because when I speak to a lot of organisations and you say, they say, well, we need to put something in place. Well, first of all, it's that knowing your data. Not all data is the same. You don't want to kind of have that sledgehammer to crack a nut. So, working with the business up front to actually kind of define what the use cases are, what the scenarios are, and focusing on that high risk data first. Because I find a lot of people say, oh, we've got that compliance score, there's thousands of items, we've got all these regulations, and people don't know where to start. So I think it's that focus, isn't it? Focusing on the most critical information first. What can you put in place? And as you say, it's an iterative process to improve your maturity over time.
Yes, absolutely. It's very wide reaching. It's not very specific. Everything could be a GRC risk. And so it really gets you to think deep into the way the organisation is structured. And to be honest, actually, when you're doing it well, again, we'll talk about what well looks like in a minute, perhaps, but when you're doing it at least reasonably well, mostly it's actually to the good of the whole business. It can improve as opposed to degrade operational performance when done well. But you really have got to embed it in the culture of the organisation. So, and again, critical for an organisation like mine as a medtech, but it applies to everybody. If you're a corner shop, you've still got to make sure you get those sort of shelf life dates, and you've still got obligations to do your tax returns, and you've still got obligations to your staff. All those things, health and safety. The list just goes on and on and on when you think about it. The kind of things for which we are as businesses, and to some extent as individuals, regulated, and therefore we have to be compliant.
So if you were like kind of giving some recommendations to people in the audience that think, well, actually, I haven't actually worked with the compliance manager before, do you have any kind of recommendations, or what kind of that first month would look like as opposed to what it would look like 6 months or a year down the line? How do people start off this journey?
Okay, that's a good question. I think probably two prongs. You know, your senior people in the organisation need to be briefed or learn or take responsibility for what GRC in the organisation is to be. So, you know, some of it is getting that team to decide what their position is on GRC, and a great place to start. There's probably two places to start in terms of doing that. One is go and look at purview. It can be quite shocking when you look at it. When you look at the long list. I mean, they've got something like I forget. I shouldn't. But yeah, about 13 different sort of core dimensions of buckets, if you like, that they squirt all these compliance activities into. But that's a good thing to look at. And again, a lot of these are good, sound sort of business process activities. So look at purview, and that'll inform the conversation. And then the second thing is perhaps, and I might be blowing our own trumpet here, go and look at the governance risk compliance competency that Nikki and I wrote for the Microsoft maturity model for Microsoft 365, which I'm going to say in public is really very little to do with Microsoft technology and everything to do with organizational maturity. We just happen to then provide some nice links to how you can do some of that using Microsoft technology. But understanding the implications of GRC, grab that maturity model competency, and it will show you. I mean, it's lovely actually. It's kind of terrifying when you grab it first, but it's laid out in 5 different levels. And level 100 is what I call the rubbish level. And most organisations will read it. They'll start at level 100 and go, "Oh, that's us." And like I say, that's the rubbish level. I won't go into the detail because you can read it yourself. But then they'll go, "Oh, well, what do we need to get to level 200? And actually going from rubbish to not terrible, level 200 is not so very hard. It's about having that strategy and some people that are responsible for it, and starting to put in some documentation and processes, and doing that kind of basic management thing that you'd probably do with any other part of the business, but make sure you do it for the GRC implications. However, this is where this particular competency is different to many other. We think that every organisation needs to be at level 300, where they've got their governance risk compliance under control. It is adequately managed, not brilliant. Brilliant's nice, but adequate, because your business reputation, your staff and directors, and ultimately your clients, etc., are directly at risk if you get it badly wrong.
Yeah, and kind of where we've kind of pitched this at, because obviously Microsoft have lots of different licensing, and particularly in the purview stuff, a lot of the really exciting features and functionality require you to have those premium compliance E5 licenses. Well, a lot of organizations haven't got that. There's a lot of small organizations that maybe only got business premium. So it's looking really at that minimal viable product. So what security and compliance functionality would you get if you've got business premium? Then everybody can do that. So that's kind of your minimum thing, is have some basic sensitivity labels, have some kind of retention policies, just that basic functionality. And then it's a case of, well, if you've got the E3 licenses, what can I then step up to make sure I'm using that type of functionality as well. So that's really where we're pitching that level 300 at, because probably less than 10% of the organizations globally are in that E5 space. So there's no point saying, "Oh, go and buy it all," because we know people won't buy those licenses.
Yeah, my company doesn't have E5 licenses. We run on E1 and E3 licenses, and yet we're absolutely compliant with all of the medical legislation that we have to be, and compliance implications we have to be. So you don't need E5 to be pretty darn good. But there are more things you can do, and they're probably, and this is kind of a concept within the maturity model anyway, you get your whole organization to an acceptable level, But then you look at where your at-risk parts of the business are. So we have some very specific things, which again I probably ought to not talk about. But we have some very specific things where we can be exposed to highly sensitive data. It means that my staff could be exposed to that data, and they shouldn't be. Some of those we can solve using some technology, but others we solve using other processes. And you've got to look at those things and go, okay, so what are those people, or what are those parts of the organisation that carry a particular risk? That's where we'll put some additional effort. So maybe we would buy an elevated purview license, or E5s, or whatever it would end up being, for specific individuals to protect those activities. So yeah, so it's try and get everything up to a reasonable, acceptable, not too scary baseline. And then when you've got to that, then look at where your high risk activities are and make sure you throw some additional effort at that. And don't expect to fix it all at once. As I said, it's huge, and it'll keep sort of wriggling underneath you as your business and the market and the regulations change.
Yeah, so people can rush into it, can't they? And just start, like you say, Simon, start turning stuff on and start actioning the assessment templates of any activities that they've got. And we've said this a number of times on this podcast, haven't we, Nikki? People go into analysis paralysis and think that compliance score, the higher it is, the better they are. But they don't realize that the higher you actually go, there's production detriments for people using labels or people accessing content and so on and so forth. So I'd always say for people, it's not how high you can get the score, it's how compliant you can make yourself. That's it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, chasing the score, useful though the score is, chasing the score is probably unwise. What you should be using is using the score and the tools and and the maturity model and all the other damn resources you can get your hand on. Using those to improve your business. And I tend to prefer this sort of broad but not too onerous approach, rather than just saying, you guys over there, you're in the clinical department, fix it. And if you don't do anything else anywhere else in the business, you probably haven't fixed the problem at all. You may have actually made it worse because there's too big a gap between the people who are trying to be really, really good, level 400 or so on the maturity model, if that's what you want to use as your benchmark, and those are still languishing down at level 100 and 200. That creates a sort of a cultural mix. Help me out here. Mismatch. That's the word I'm after. Thank you. So I think I'm always cautious, and it's actually something we've done in maturity model workshop, but making sure you haven't got big deviations between different types of the organisation, because that causes different issues. It's the people who go, well, you can't do that because, and the others who say, well, I have to because, and then you've got an argument. So broad, build it up across the broad base, nice and slowly, with a bit of extra emphasis where it matters. Don't chase the number. But the number is a good way to see whether you're making progress across the board. But also remember, the number doesn't, the purview number doesn't tell you about everything. It's got no concept of whether your staff are trained.
Yep.
But if one of those auditors that might come and visit me because of DTAC or one of the other compliance obligations I have, come and visit, one of the first things they're going to do is reach for the document that says these are your trained people. And purview will have completely ignored that. So purview is one of the tools. There's got to be others as well. What we ended up doing, as I understood more and more about the breadth of this, we took our original governance portal, and over about a year, 2 years, we developed that into a full GRC portal, which includes purview insights, but has got the tools and the documents and the evidence and the trackers for all of the other things we do. And if this weren't both a podcast as well as a video feed, I'd pull some screenshots up. But maybe I can provide some links to those.
Yeah, we'll certainly put some links in, as we always do, won't we, Nikki?
Yeah, I think that's important, so people can kind of see some of the other activities. And I think it's really important that, I always say, governance, risk and compliance is not a project, it's a lifestyle. Yeah. It's that cultural change, from the bottom to the top of the organisation. You've all got to kind of know where you want to go, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. And it's not something you just turn up to one training session. You know, I think too often people say, turn up to this training, tick a few boxes, you know, we're now compliant. It really isn't like that. It is really that cultural change, it's that reinforcing, and then it's looking at how you can improve your maturity over time. You know, just think of Microsoft Ignite a few weeks ago, how many announcements they provided across the, you know, the whole of Microsoft 365. It's some of those things can disrupt your current environment. Some of those things can really help you. They've got new, you know, things like the new DLP policies where you kind of got extra functionality there, and you can have more granular policies. You can say, now that was something I couldn't do before. Now I've got this functionality. Now I can add in some additional layers. So it's really important just to keep looking back, as you say, Simon. You're doing that now a weekly basis, just to make sure everything's okay.
I think that's a really good point. There's two things you've got to keep an active eye on. One is, what are the new tools that, you know, Microsoft or others might have provided you that unlocks another piece of the puzzle or makes it easier for you to do the things you're trying to do. But in parallel, you've got to keep your eye on, well, what are the other compliance obligations you've got? So, yeah, I've actually started a thing within the company now to start looking at what the environmental policies are likely to be. We're a really low environmental impact organisation. We don't make things, we don't burn things. Yeah, that's just great. But I've already started looking at our suppliers, including Microsoft. You know, what are their capabilities for giving me net zero, you know, services? Because I think that's going to be something which will be. I know it's nice to have. I think it's an important part of the way that we think about our business ethics, but I think in a few years' time, those are going to be obligations. You know, that's another compliance box you're going to have to tick. And whether Microsoft will help with ticking that off, apart from fact, actually, Azure's meant to be carbon neutral in 25, yeah, I don't know. But I'm starting to think about that horizon scanning of what's the technology going to do, what's the regulatory landscape going to do, what are the implications on my businesses as a consequence. And as you say, Nikki, it's a lifestyle choice. Ultimately, it's a business lifestyle choice. It's not a nice to have. It's the law.
Exactly.
Okay, I think that's kind of like a really good kind of end to it, isn't it? Governance, risk, and compliance is not nice to have. It's the law, and I think at the end of the day, people need to understand that. So, you know, you would want, as an individual, the companies you deal with, you want them to look after your data and make sure it's safe and secure. You know, you're now, you know, on the other foot, you're looking after other people's information, and you would want to treat it in the same way as you would want other people to treat your data.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's worth saying because, you know, look, I'm a Microsoft guy with one of my hats on, but, you know, this applies to all the other technology platforms you may be running in the business. You know, they all need to be, you know, running to this same sort of high level of excellence in terms of not only security, but the way you look at the GRC wrapper around with those. So, yeah, so other technologies may exist and you can use those too.
Quite right. Quite right. And I think that's us, right, Nikki?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Simon, for coming in today and putting that real business perspective on it. What we didn't want this podcast to be was just, you know, here's a look at the technology. We wanted to really show how it can be used in the industry. So thank you very much for explaining how you use it in your work. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers, Simon.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me in.
You're more than welcome. Thanks very much. All right, then. Thanks for now. We'll
Cheers,
see you
everybody.
soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.